need to go. And um, I'm going to just start out, and maybe I'll come out of the screen for a second, um, talking with you about something that isn't the main topic of my class today. And that's what's happening in Iran. And so I want to say a fair bit about what's happening in Iran and maybe do a whole class on this at some point soon. But for today, as you maybe saw, I'm going to speak with you about Minneapolis and Venezuela and not much at all about Greenland, but I think I would put Greenland in the same category of manufactured emergencies, emergencies that are being produced by this president, in part for the effect that they're going to have in the way in which he perceives it on different political institutions, on the balance of power internationally or domestically. He thinks through the sheer act of invading Venezuela for oil or bringing ICE and Customs and Border Patrol into Minneapolis in what I think is really an effort to blockade and then break the city's power structure, right? To break the culture of the city, that he can accomplish something directly by producing an emergency, right? And in a sense, right, we know this as the deep logic of authoritarianism, that if the justification for this consolidation of power, the unilateralism, the dependence on a strongman leader is, well, an emergency demands that we have this kind of power and leadership in this moment. And if the apparent emergency actually begins to lose its luster, doesn't seem to justify that form of power, very often the aspiring autocrat tries to manufacture another emergency, right? So we've got a number of manufactured emergencies. If I think that the almost unfathomable happens and the US takes military action against Greenland and Denmark and its NATO allies in order to seize control of that territory, and don't get me wrong, I know we have a crazy president. I don't think he's that crazy, right? So having said that, I will say that that would be another manufactured emergency or crisis. Whereas what is happening in Iran is not a manufactured emergency or crisis. It is real. It is spontaneously developing. We have maybe contributed a very small amount to it. We've contributed to it in part by bombing Iran earlier this summer in a way that I think is humiliating to the regime, that diminishes its prestige and stature in the eyes of its own people. The one thing maybe that this regime could claim had bolstered its international reputation was its nuclear program, and now that program has been substantially damaged. We may also be contributing to the crisis in Iran through our oil embargo, right? Through the difficulties that we're creating for the Iranians to actually get the full value of really the main resource that sustains the country's economy. But, right, that's different from, right, actually producing the emergency through direct action. That's not what's happening here. The Iranian people are producing the emergency because they are withdrawing support and legitimacy for the regime. I'll say this very quickly. I think there are three main sources of stability in the Iranian regime. There's a substantial portion of the population who supports the kind of Muslim orthodoxy that the regime is imposing on society and therefore supports the regime. There's another substantial portion of the population that is willing to tolerate what the regime does, which is to repress freedom and to impose orthodoxy if the regime, quote, delivers the goods, if the material basis of life is good enough for them to feel like they are able to meet their needs. And then there's a third, right, substantial portion of the population of Iran that is repressed, right? And that the repression, the surveillance is sufficiently ubiquitous, violent, dangerous, that they put up with it. And there's some overlap between group two and group three, those who feel like they're getting the goods, and those who feel like to challenge the regime would be a fool's errand, just a good way to end up in jail, tortured, and killed, right? And so I think part of what's happening in Iran right now is that the regime is no longer delivering the goods, and the people are therefore restive. And the regime so far seems not to be able to spread intimidation thoroughly and deeply enough to keep the population off the streets. I think it's a little hard to know exactly what's happening in Iran. Our news sources are limited. The figure on casualties, I've heard 600. That seems to be a conservative, verifiable figure, but I've also heard 12,000, right? And that seems to be perhaps the propaganda that's being put out by those who want the support of the United States in overthrowing the regime, or the support of Israel or the Saudis or the Russians. And so I just don't think we have enough good information to know how well the regime continues to control and command the instruments of violence on which it relies in situations like this. And from the history of modern revolutions, going back to the French Revolution and forward to the Russian Revolution and forward to, right, the various nonviolent revolutions of the late 20th century. One of the things I think we look at when we try to determine whether or not this is a moment where a regime may actually collapse is whether or not the functionaries of the regime who have to use the instruments of violence against the population of the society are still willing to do that, right? And the larger the protest grows, the greater the likelihood that you, if you're one of the people who, right, has to mow people down, are going to end up killing your cousin, your neighbor, your sibling, your wife's school friend, right? And that you may, right, not be able to face yourself. You may lose the right support of your family and your friends if you continue to do what you've been doing up until this point. That's the point that these regimes very often collapse, because they can no longer use violence to repress their own population. Having said that, in the case of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, what the regime has done, I think, very cleverly, and this is the way of authoritarian regimes the world over, they have enriched the members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to a degree that they would never hope to be, absent the regime being a kleptocracy, stealing much of the petro wealth and giving it to the people who do their dirty work, right, among others. And in the scenario in which there's a successful revolution, the members of the Revolutionary Guard, on the one hand, maybe die in the actual overthrow, or else are jailed in the aftermath for their crimes while the regime was in place, but certainly lose much of their wealth and much of the access to the ongoing accumulation of wealth, right? And so that's the incentive they have. The question that I don't think we have any real way to answer is, in fact, how likely is it that the incentive is changing for the functionaries of the regime to the point where they will no longer do its dirty work anymore? I'll say one more thing, and it is a give credit where credit is due scenario. I do believe that Donald Trump, in part because of his willingness to use the instruments of the American military in, right, highly targeted strategic ways, right? And please note, I think he's bombed 8 countries in his first year in his second term as president. He has bombed Iran. He has obviously invaded Venezuela. He's shot boats at sea. He's bombed various places in Africa as well. That when he says, if they execute those people, we will consider military retaliation, that may very well have prevented the Iranian regime from executing some of these protesters. Having said that, I want to now note, and I think it's really fascinating to see, that both the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Russians are all urging the United States not to intervene militarily, and they seem to prefer the hobbled revolutionary Islamic State of Iran to the uncertainty of what might follow if that regime collapses, right? And I think that they have good strategic reasons to weigh things in the way that they do, because what follows in the wake of a successful revolution is not necessarily a better regime or any regime, right? It could be the collapse of the right great civilization of Persia. It could be the dismembering of the modern state of Iran and its territorial basis. It could be a failed state, which would make room for a number of non-state actors who might be more dangerous to Israel or the Saudis, or less willing to cooperate with the Russians than is the current regime of Iran. And here then I want to pause and ask, does the United States have a long-term strategic vision for the Middle East and for Iran? Are we playing the medium term or the long-term game? And here I want to say I think the obvious answer is no. And this speaks again to the policy making dysfunction of the Trump White House. Donald Trump himself seems to think very much transactionally, very much in terms of dominating the short term news cycle as a result of his actions. He can get up and say at Mar-a-Lago this weekend that he prevented the Iranians from executing their own citizens, and he's right, and he deserves credit for it, and it's a win, but it's not the same thing as having a long-term policy. That's hard, slow, meticulous, subtle, behind the scenes work that frankly is not going to dominate the next news cycle, may never come to the fore, right? And it doesn't appear that Donald Trump has the patience, the interest, the wherewithal for that stuff, right? And in this White House, it appears that what Donald Trump is interested in dictates what the entire apparatus of the executive branch does. And again, I just think we have to remember in a situation like this how anomalous that is. That the State Department seems to have no autonomy, that the national security agencies, if they have autonomy, don't have policy setting capacity. Right? And that's because the president isn't paying attention to it and doesn't care about it. He cares about dominating the news cycle. He cares about producing the theater of power, of spectacle. And if he can do that, then he's interested in it. If he can't, he appears to lose interest and doesn't allow the agencies of the executive branch to pursue those long-term agendas independently. So that's just a little bit about Iran and the contrast between Iran, right, and what we're going to talk about, the spontaneous, the genuine emergency that, right, comes from outside and requires a country like the United States to react. and whether or not we're actually able to react, as opposed to, right, the kind of emergency that Donald Trump clearly welcomes and aims to produce, the kind where our federal government's action produces it in the immediate present, and maybe it can also be resolved very quickly because we have made it. So I want to be clear. That doesn't mean that the emergency in Minneapolis is any less genuine than the emergency in Tehran, but they belong to different kinds of emergency. All right, so any questions or thoughts about Iran before we get into talking again about domestic American politics? All right, then I will move on. Feel free to unmute, raise your hand at any point. I just wanted to pause for a second. Let me now get my slides back up. And as you can see, I want to talk again. And I'm going to continue to follow the story in Minneapolis quite closely, and to suggest that, right, there have been two invasions in early 2026 by the United States federal government. One is in Venezuela. It's over, although we don't know yet what the aftermath of it will be. The other is in Minneapolis, and it is ongoing. And that they are connected, right? They are efforts of a diminished president to reassert power, to show that although he may not be popular, although his policies may be widely perceived as having failed, that is not going to diminish his capacity to use violence in the way that being the president of the United States, he believes permits him to, and in ways that demand that he continue to be taken seriously, and that in a sense we bow to his will given his capacity to dominate using violence. And I say it's not just that this is Donald Trump's reaction to his diminished stature within our society, but also a sign of our diminished democracy. The ongoing quiescence of Congress, right? The complete and utter failure of the Republican Party, which controls both houses of Congress, to restrain this president's lawless and grotesque use of violence against increasingly American citizens, is a sign that American democracy is increasingly diminished, fragile, malfunctioning. And I'll be right clear about the fact that I am actually heartened by what happened in the judiciary at the end of this week, which is to say, right, that there is now a restraining order on federal agents in Minneapolis that prevents them from doing much of what they have been doing, from tear gassing, from using rubber bullets and pepper spray and pepper balls, and right, breaking the windows out of cars and hauling citizens out who are not actually impeding them, who are observing them, who are protesting them, who are recording them because they know that they lie about what they're doing, and therefore that an independent record needs to be created. All of that is the exercise of constitutional rights. And the fact that, right, a judge has stood up and said that this should not, cannot legally continue, I think is a healthy sign. But having said that, I'm not at all confident that that right restraining order will be upheld as it is appealed, as it no doubt will be, or that the on the ground forces in, right, Minneapolis or other American cities will actually follow the judge's order. We have seen again and again with this administration that they do not often follow lower court orders, that they actually find ways to defy or do end runs around those orders, and that very often by the time that comes to light, the Supreme Court or an appellate court has actually removed the restraint that a circuit court has imposed. So, having said that, right, I do think that the other thing that is extremely interesting and important here is the resolve of the citizens of Minneapolis who are out on the streets in force despite, right, the violence. And one of the things that came out of the hearing, right, in which a woman who had been recently arrested and detained by ICE for observing a protest and recording it, not for, right, impeding law enforcement officers, right? She was handcuffed, thrown in the back of an unmarked car, and as they were taking her to a detention center, the ICE officer turned around and said to her, and I quote, "Didn't you see what we did to that bitch?" Right? Which is, of course, Renee Good that they're referring to, the woman who, right, I believe was executed by an ICE officer because, right, he did not like the way she was protesting their mission. And that's, right, tremendous courage, right, for the people of Minneapolis to recognize that these are, right, lawless, ruthless, cruel paramilitary forces occupying their city, and that they are there to intimidate, to rough up, to repress the people of the city, and the people of the city are having none of it. And so I note, right, this is a diagram of protests against the Trump immigration and deportation policies in the United States in the first half of 2025, right? And my joke about this is it looks like the United States has measles. Every place that there's been a protest, there's a red dot. There's been a protest in every state. There's been a protest in every metropolitan area in the United States. And by the way, there have been hundreds of protests in smaller, right, suburban communities, rural communities. And so I don't think at this point it's likely that these protests are going to subside. I think, in fact, it's likely that they're going to continue to grow, particularly in light of the visceral, emotional impact of seeing Renee Macklin Good having been killed for no good reason by these officials. And that it is also unlikely that the White House or ICE or Customs and Border Patrol are going to back down. And so I do think that there's likely to be escalating conflicts and violence for much of the remainder of 2026. I want to analyze and discuss why that is and what the underlying dynamics at work are here. Before I do that, I want to point out, right, that if you were to look at the images I have on the board right now, especially the bottom four, I think if you didn't have context, if you didn't know where they were, you would assume that this was a theater of war, a city that is occupied by a hostile military force, not a law enforcement operation in an American city. And so I do think we have a wholly occupied American city, occupied by federal paramilitary forces, and that they are violently attacking any of the citizens of the city who reject the deportation politics and who are willing to protest it. That they're attacking the city and the motivations are complex, right? But I think fundamentally because Minneapolis embraces immigration, does not want to deport the people who are deeply integrated into their community, and who want instead a multiracial future to diversify their city, that these people are treated as the enemy within. And I'll just say this, I don't want to belabor the obvious, but right, the pretext, right, at least one of the main pretexts to justify what's happening in Minneapolis is that there is corruption in the Somali community. And I think there is well documented fraud that has occurred, particularly in the appropriation of funds that were designed to combat COVID and to pursue public health in the aftermath of COVID. This is not, to state the obvious, what an anti corruption investigation or law enforcement operation looks like, right? There's, right, it's just on its face obvious that the pretext does not fit the actual operation, right? And so I will just put this very briefly. Most Americans are not persuaded that this kind of cruelty is necessary or that it will restore order. It may seem a little quaint to be looking at public opinion research, but I do think it actually matters. Obviously, not as much as the killing of an American citizen by a federal paramilitary officer or the ongoing repression of constitutional freedom in Minneapolis. But, right, one of the questions is, will these tactics shift long term public opinion in the United States? Will they either succeed in convincing us that the deportation policies work, or succeed in convincing us that the president is still effective and powerful, or at least, right, succeed in convincing us we don't like the president, we don't like the policy, but we better stay home because it's too dangerous to publicly express our disapproval or our opinion. And it doesn't appear that it's doing any of that, right? So the majority of Americans believe that the execution of Renee Good was unjustified, right? And that's nearly a 2-to-1 margin. A majority of Americans do not believe that ICE enforcement actions are making their cities safer, right? By the way, I didn't put it on the board. A recent poll shows that a plurality of Americans now favor abolishing ICE. That was a substantial minority view at the beginning of 2025. The policies of the last year have delegitimated ICE in the eyes of the American people. Donald Trump's overall immigration policy is deeply unpopular. 53%, again, a majority, disapprove of this policy. And by the way, a majority disapprove of Donald Trump. It's up to over, I believe, 55%. Am I seeing that correctly? Yes, 55% disapproval rating. And by the way, in a democracy, that should matter. It should matter to what the president and his administration are doing. It should matter to what Congress does in order to restrain what the president is doing if the president continues to be heels dug in, pursuing an unpopular policy. And in a sense, I do think it matters, but not nearly as much as it should. It matters for how we describe this, right? And I want to be as clear as possible. I think Donald Trump is an aspirational authoritarian. I think he is continuing to implement the autocrat's playbook. I think he is, right, undaunted by the failure of his first term, I'm sorry, his first year of his second term to demonstrate the popularity of that, right, effort to fundamentally remake the structure of American government so that we have a much stronger executive, much less restrained by Congress, by law, by court. It's not winning the approval of the American people, but it is also not, right, preventing or not changing the course of our policy quickly enough. But let me be as clear and nuanced at the same time as possible about what I want to say here. And that is that on the one hand, America in 2026 may have an aspiring authoritarian president who is undaunted by the unpopularity of his policies. But we do not have the successful implementation of the autocrat's playbook. The people of Minneapolis, of Chicago, of Washington, D.C., of Los Angeles are showing us, right, that the American people will not be intimidated into surrendering their freedom. So I just want to be as clear as possible about that. But let me try to drill down on what I think Donald Trump's play is here. I don't think he's actually trying to persuade the majority of Americans that he is an effective autocrat or that they should be intimidated by him. I think he is really appealing to the segment of the populace and the electorate that has always been his most loyal, that really vaulted him into political viability in 2015 and 2016. These are people, and I've got on the board, right, Arlie Russell Hochschild's Stolen Pride and Catherine Kramer's The Politics of Resentment, their studies of rural Wisconsin, of rural and ex-urban Ohio and Kentucky, that these are places, and I think it applies to Minnesota, I think it applies to Michigan, where a substantial portion of the non-urban population feels like the urban center, the capital, has, first of all, fundamentally departed from their political views, that it's become well-educated liberal elite who has captured the capital and who welcomes these new diverse people into their midst. They care more about LGBTQ rights or trans people or immigrants or affirmative action or feminism than they do about the what many people regard as the backbone of the state and the country, the white, native born, working class, straight, traditional Christian people who feel, right in the title of one of the books I look at when I look at this stuff, We're Still Here, like the liberal elite would just as soon pretend they don't exist. And that the consequence of the policy being implemented by the urban majority in a state like Minnesota is that the prospects, the standing, the security of the white working class rural population has been deeply damaged. And I think for the most part, they've given up on having their path to prosperity restored, their precariousness addressed. What they want at this point is to hurt the people who've hurt them. They want vengeance. And so when Donald Trump says at the Conservative Political Action Committee address in March of 2023, when he's beginning to gain traction again as a Republican presidential nominee for 2024, quote, I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution, right? That is what Donald Trump is trying to display. I said this is what I would do. I would take vengeance on your behalf against those who've damaged you. Now watch me do it, right? So he's trying to break Minneapolis in the same way that Putin is trying to break Ukraine. It's a retribution campaign against a liberal capital's perceived neglect of the state's white rural population. And his goal is to shore up critical support by mobilizing this extreme minority's appetite for vengeance, not by seeking democratic legitimacy. By the way, I don't think the prospects for this succeeding in, right, allowing an autocratic transformation of the presidency or of the American federal government are good. But that does seem to me to be where the president is going. And just to be clear, right, as we discussed last week, I'll be really quick in just providing a little bit more analysis here. I think that part of what he's trying to do is to do what Fox News did in the aftermath of the execution of George Floyd in 2020, right? And that is to recast what our eyes can plainly see is an unjustified use of force into some sort of resistance of law and order, some sort of threat to the right stability of our system of government, the standing of good law-abiding people, and that when Fox did this, it did it by emphasizing looting and rioting, and it played on a perpetual loop on its network images because there really was looting, there really was rioting in the Black Lives Matter protests. It was just a very, very small minority of what was almost entirely peaceful protests, right? It was concentrated in a few cities, a few events, and distorted in a way that allowed the public to believe, or at least important segments of the public to be manipulated to believe, that the lawlessness was much more widespread than in fact it was. And this is because we have a damaged public sphere, a damaged media system, especially due to social media-based partitions, sub-publics, as I call them, right? But the way in which we're in echo chambers or silos, but also the way in which, and there's a lot of analysis of this, we have become so segregated in our networks of communication, so fractured, so that the people watching Fox News may have very little interaction with the people or the content being broadcast via CNN or MSNBC or PBS, choose your network, and that the result is that we have what Yeshai Bankler and colleagues call a propaganda feedback loop in the right-wing media ecosystem, in which if disinformation confirms the prior convictions, the identity of those who inhabit this media system, it is likely to take hold and be presented as true, as credible, as verified, despite the fact that it isn't, and that the Trump administration is relying on the fact that our media system has become asymmetrical, right? And that a large portion of the media system essentially functions as a state propaganda system and broadcasts lies and propaganda for the administration, right? And that what we see, I think, quite clearly, and so I'll just spend a moment on this, right? There's more and more footage and analysis coming out of what happened between right, the officer in question, right, Ross, and what happened in Minneapolis in the killing of Renee Macklin-Good, and the idea that this administration is saying that he wasn't just hit by her car. The footage certainly makes it appear that he initiates contact with the trunk of her car. He leans in and puts his arm on it. There's ice. Her car's sliding. He's sliding. So maybe he's just stabilizing himself. But he then, right, shoots 3 times without the car, it appears, ever so much as grazing him. By the way, we now can make out the audio from his phone when he says fucking bitch, right, to her as he shoots her, right? Doesn't seem like fear, something very different from fear, right? But more importantly, the administration then says, not only is he hit by her car, he's run over, that he has to go to a hospital where he's treated for internal bleeding, right? And I'm sorry, I don't have information other than what we all have, the right footage of this. I will be absolutely flabbergasted if that turns out to be true. I think this is just naked, reckless, shameless lying from agency heads, from the President of the United States, from his press secretary, and that this is in part the MO of this administration. They don't care for the truth. They believe they can produce whatever truth fits their purposes. This is what we talked about last time. They are actively hostile to the rule of law and judicial supervision because it establishes an independent record of truth and because that potentially limits their exercise of power. And so the idea that this is what we're struggling against, I think, is absolutely clear. Now, I've noted to you, right, that on the one hand, the judge has restricted what the ICE and other law enforcement, federal law enforcement agents can do to the people of Minneapolis, and thank goodness, right? But at the same time, the idea that the administration appears to be taking early steps for a criminal investigation into Democratic elected officials in Minnesota, again, just speaks to the degree to which the Justice Department has been deeply corrupted into being an instrument of the president's vengeance campaign, an instrument to try to repress opposition, an instrument to try to discredit the critics of the administration, right? And to be as clear as possible, what they seem to be suggesting is that because the governor of Minnesota, the mayor of Minneapolis have encouraged their citizens to engage in peaceful protests, they are engaged in a conspiracy to impede law enforcement in Minneapolis, right? And to be as clear as possible, right? What they're saying is exercising your constitutional rights in 2026 represents a crime. So I will say this very quickly, right? We've heard some talk of Donald Trump invoking the um, Insurrection Act if he is unable to do what he wants to do in Minneapolis with ICE and right other law enforcement agencies alone. And I want to just on the one hand indicate that I think that this may not be as much of a threat as Donald Trump thinks it is. On the one hand, I've got some of the key provisions, Section 252 and 253 of the Insurrection Act on the board. And as you can see, they give very wide and vague permission for the president to employ the military domestically, right? The idea that if there's an unlawful combination, domestic violence, or conspiracy that hinders the execution of the laws, or even more broadly, unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages that make it impractical to enforce the law, right? As Stephen Vladeck said recently, that could mean if you use your SUV to block a street, that on this interpretation, the Insurrection Act is right capable of being lawfully invoked. It creates this very wide opening for the president to deploy the military domestically. But I want to say that this may be less of a threat to our freedom or to our democracy than Donald Trump seems to think that it is. He seems to identify the Insurrection Act with gaining new powers, perhaps with the kind of power that a president gains when he declares martial law, and that is actually not accurate. What this allows the president to do is to use the military to enforce existing law, not to impose the president's decrees or wills. And here I'll say this very quickly. I think that probably I would rather be at a protest being patrolled by the military than being patrolled by ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. I think the military is a more disciplined organization. I think it's more diversely constituted racially and ideologically in terms of its members. I think the culture of the military is much more one of lawfulness and nonpartisanship, whereas the culture of these federal paramilitary organizations is increasingly one of partisan vindictiveness, right? And that there may be some threats to the 2026 election and its integrity, but I think they come much more from the effort to redistrict or from the effort to get MAGA officials in charge of election law and the tabulation of votes than they come from the Insurrection Act. So I'll be quick in just pointing to, I think, some of the deeper ideas that I'm thinking about as I think about what's playing out in Minneapolis. I've pointed you recently to the recently published book, Laura Field's Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right, that looks into, if you will, the world view of MAGA by looking at some of the intellectuals, the academics, the people who've written books and articles arguing that we need a president like Donald Trump in the 21st century. And the overarching worldview here is that we're in the midst of a civilizational battle, right? This is not ordinary politics. Globalization, immigration are existential threats. They're not potentially economically advantageous, and by the way, not enlivening our society, replenishing not only our workforce but our culture, the way in which I think I tend to view them and many of the people I speak with tend to view them, but instead um, they are diluting and undermining American culture, right? That we're in the middle of a widespread but still incomplete transition to what I would call a post-traditional culture, a culture in which, rather than feeling bound by the religion of my parents or the customs, the mores, the manners of my parents, I say, well, I'll accept what I think is valid, and what doesn't persuade me, what doesn't convince me, I'll revise, I'll change, I'll discard, right? So that tradition per se doesn't bind post traditional cultures and values, and that the view on the part of the intellectuals who furnish the right justification for the MAGA right is that this is a catastrophe for Christianity in the United States, but also for America, right? And for many Americans. That there are many people who are good citizens who want to continue their traditions, their culture, their religion, their values, and who are impeded from doing so by the larger post-traditional culture, and that this is not just making life hard for them, it's actually undermining the values that sustain the American political system. And by the way, there's an effort to identify an enemy here, right? There's a corrupt elite and their allies who are, quote, woke in their values, but also weak. They believe in the rule of law. They believe in deliberation. They believe in constitutional rights. And in these conditions, right, those values don't allow us to meet the challenges of the 21st century. They don't allow us, for instance, to prevent ourselves from being overwhelmed by migrants. There's also, I think, a fundamental epistemic stance here, which is that this idea that experts and academics and journalists are able to identify valid and verifiable knowledge is just the ideology of the woke left. It's not genuine. Then really power and authority make truth, or at least credence, what people tend to believe, and that therefore we're not going to play this game anymore. We're not going to defer to the experts. We are going to act in defense of ourselves. The deed is more important than the word. Will and action are at the root of claims to truth. Deliberation, verification, expertise, understanding disguise the fact that we are ultimately imposing our truths, but they also are just a camouflaged way of doing it. There's the essential political mode of this form of politics that will empower, produce images and spectacles which can produce new realities and new truths, and that this is enabled by the new technological and media environment. And I'm thinking about this. I'm not really ready to fully talk about it, but I do believe that there's a new kind of authoritarianism in the 21st century, and that is what you might call a technological authoritarianism. It's the way in which our new technology creates the capacity for forms of surveillance that were never conceivable to even George Orwell, right? That they create the capacity for bullying, for using subtle mechanisms of coercion, not through the government, but through the media system, especially social media. And that while the courts seem like a good place to stop this onslaught, they haven't actually been as effective, in part because, right, the justice system has been so corrupted, in part because the Supreme Court, especially using the emergency docket, but also appellate courts, have undone much of what I view as the good work of the circuit courts. But, and this is a critical, I think, caveat at the end of this, I don't think this necessarily works in America. The media, the courts, congressional hearings, the public resistance demonstrations, social movements still have the capacity to challenge and ultimately expose the lying, the mendacity, the right actual weakness underlying this president and these politics. And in part to motivate that, in part to remind us, right, where we come from and what our culture is and what it truly values. I want to spend just a minute or two today looking at the Declaration of Independence, which of course we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of, right, this deed and this text. And please note, right, this is, it seems to me, the founding deed, the true founding deed of the United States of America. And it's a deed that is a text that doesn't aim to produce an image or produce a truth through the violent imposition of will or coercion, but instead that makes an argument to the world that says reason is on our side, that what we are doing is valid and right. And so I'm going to read the very familiar second paragraph of the first real substantive declaration in the Declaration of Independence. You're no doubt familiar. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And so, right, to not belabor it, I think it's absolutely clear that what the people of Minneapolis are doing in resisting ICE is exactly what the people of Boston were doing in the 1770s. They're resisting tyranny. They're asserting their rights. They are the true American patriots. I will just conclude very briefly. We know, right, of course, that Thomas Jefferson is the author of the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. It's ultimately written by a committee, but a few ideas from Jefferson about the need for messy protest politics to sustain the spirit of liberty, right? He starts one of his letters to James Madison from 1787 as right, they're debating about Shays' rebellion in Western Massachusetts with the right Latin phrase, "I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. Even this evil is productive of good," the rebellion, right? And to be as clear as possible, Jefferson concedes that the rebellion is kind of silly, but he says it prevents the degeneracy of government and nourishes a general attention to public affairs. I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical, right? If we didn't have the occasional storm, I'm looking out the window at the snow, then there would be too much humidity in the air. It needs to be released. If we don't have the occasional protest or social movement, it means we have become quiescent, that we're no longer paying attention to our politics, that we're no longer capable of standing up for our liberty when government comes and encroaches on it. Unsuccessful rebellions indeed generally establish the encroachments on the rights of people which have produced them. An observation of this truth should render honest Republican governors so mild in their punishment of rebellions as not to discourage them too much. It is the medicine necessary for the sound health of government, right? I think I can stop there. I think you get the idea that Jefferson, right, in a letter to Stephen Smith later in his life says, look, if there's not frequent enough rebellion, then probably it means that the society is no longer animated by the spirit of liberty. I just think, right, we have to bear in mind our culture, our tradition, our history, our proudest documents. Among our proudest contributions to the democratic political culture the world over is the proud tradition of civil disobedience. If the law is manifestly unjust, so much so that you have no moral obligation to obey it, then you may have a duty to disobey the law, but you don't skulk around like a criminal trying to avoid detection. You openly disobey the law. In so doing, hoping to appeal to the conscience and the sense of justice of your fellow citizens and to tell them as clearly as possible, this is what the abuse of power looks like. This is what the persecution of a minority looks like. This is what injustice looks like. And we need to recognize it is right disguised under the pretext of the rule of law, not actually what law requires of us. The people of Minneapolis are not our enemies, right? They're not lawless. They're the true patriots, the people who are actually standing up for the deepest American values, the values that ground our Constitution and our system of the rule of law. We need to remember that as we enter 2026. It needs to embolden us. It needs to give us courage as we think through what we should do as an aspiring autocrat increasingly uses a paramilitary force to try to repress opposition. I'll stop there. Want to hear your comments. I'm obviously being quite provocative today. Who wants to start us out? Flossie, I think you're unmuted already. Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yes. When I look at uh, the Chronicle, um, our San Francisco Chronicle, I get the picture just from the front page that things are hunky-dory, that Mayor Lurie is having a ball, he's doing big things, he's making a lot of people happy. There's a lot of building going on. There are a lot of parks being reconstructed. There is worry about flooding and fires. And you have to look very carefully and keep turning the pages to get a slightly different view. And I think you have to go to the Times and the more conservative papers, oddly enough, to pick up what's happening.
That's interesting. I'm not someone who reads the Chronicle very
I
frequently,
know.
even when I'm in San Francisco, maybe for the reason that you're indicating. But yes, I do think um, one of right the efforts that autocrats rely on, or at least the attempt to impose, is an effort to um, make the world seem so dangerous, so bleak, so depressing that people retreat into privacy and concentrate on whatever is near to them that still seems to be good, right? It would pain me if the right major newspaper of the San Francisco Bay Area is actually complicit in this. But let us remember, it's part of. I spoke a little bit about the uh, degradation of the public sphere and the media system in American democracy in the 21st century. Not enough, but a little bit today. And I do think, right, the fact that newspapers are an endangered species, right? The Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post are doing just fine because they're dominating, because people in San Francisco and Seattle and Chicago are all reading, right, the papers of DC and New York rather than their local papers. That the local papers have lost so much revenue to online competition that they have a very hard time sustaining themselves, and maybe they're dumbing themselves down or going for the human interest stories in
Yes.
order to bolster their circulation and keep themselves economically viable. But yes, we have high concentration of media ownership, right? The merger that is happening or that is proposed to happen, right, with Netflix and Paramount slugging it out. I do think, right, that we need to be worried about the infrastructure of democracy. The media's health is essential to the public sphere, which is essential to the health of democracy, and it's not good. And in a sense, Trump and this administration are relying on that. They are seeding lies and propaganda because they don't think that investigative journalism is going to expose them, as opposed to thinking that the opposite. The right wing media system is going to function like state media and just amplify whatever they say. All right. Thank you as always, Flossie. Obviously productive. Liz
Um,
James.
David, hi.
Hi.
Hi,
Go
everybody.
ahead.
I
Yay.
don't know a lot of you, but I know some of you and want to say hi. I read the Chronicle every morning and I admire them for fighting for San Francisco. They remind us how beautiful this place is, how much interesting stuff is there. And I appreciate the upbeat articles very much, not because they're falsely cheerful, but because they are fighting the trash that everybody is that others around the country say about our state and about our Bay Area.
Thank you,
So,
Liz. And I suspect many of you do know Liz, but if you don't, Liz is the reason I'm talking to you right now. She's the person who brought me into Piedmont Garden almost a decade ago, right? So nice to see your face,
yeah.
Liz, and thank you for that contribution as well. And miss you. But moving on to what you said, I do think, right, one of the lies that the Trump administration is trying to seed in our public sphere. And I will go back to, give me a second, what Trump said at CPAC, right, which is the Conservative Political Action Committee in 2023. And I didn't read this part out to you, but let me see if I can get there. Sorry, I'll get there. Right, he said, right, the sinister forces trying to kill America have done everything they can to stop me, to silence you, and to turn this nation into a socialist dumping ground for criminals, junkies, Marxist thugs, radicals, and dangerous refugees that no other country wants. No other country wants them. If those opposing us succeed, our once beautiful USA will be a failed country that no one will even recognize. A lawless, open border, crime ridden, filthy communist nightmare, right? And by the way, that's exactly what Donald Trump wants us to believe Minneapolis is, San Francisco is. And so I was thinking this as I was responding to Flossie's initial question. Like I say, I don't read the Chronicle, so I don't have enough information. But maybe part of what it's trying to do is to say, don't believe the hype. Right, I come to San Francisco a couple times a year. I hope you know I'll be there in person on the last Saturday of this month. So I'll see you in a couple weeks. And the experience I have in San Francisco is always positive, right? I have friends who say, well, when I think about San Francisco, I think it's overrun with homeless people and human excrement and needles and drugs. And, you know, there may be some of that in places, but I don't think that that's what San Francisco is. I know it's not, right? And so maybe part of what the Chronicle is doing is in part trying to say, let's have an accurate picture of San Francisco.
Yes, I definitely think there's that's what they're doing, and I appreciate it.
And similarly for Minneapolis, right? You know, Minneapolis, the crime rate went up around COVID as it did in many American cities. It's come back down. It's not a dangerous city, right? And the Somali population is not a lawless population, not a socialist population, not a criminal population. That's all just propaganda, right? And it is funneling, channeling, expressing the anger and resentment of other people in the state. And that anger and resentment is, right, there for a reason. They really have lost mobility. They really have become much more precarious, much more insecure. Their economy is faltering. The state and the federal government are not doing enough to assist them. But that doesn't mean it's the fault of the Somalis or the fault of the governor or the mayor for allowing them into the country. That's the classical scapegoating of populist nativist politics. Let's make this easy and find someone to blame and then go after them. And yeah, maybe when you've been hurt, it makes you feel good for a little while to feel like somebody else is being hurt because they hurt you. But in the long term, it doesn't address the source of the grievance. And in the long term, most decent people don't actually end up feeling better because the wrong people have been made to suffer because you're suffering, right? And so recognizing the deeper stakes of defending a liberal city and saying that the propaganda about it is not accurate, I think is also important. All right.
Thank you,
So,
David.
yeah,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
Good. Really nice seeing you. I think about calling you every now and then. I'm just so damn busy, but you're on my
I,
mind. Yes.
I can understand why you're busy.
Hope your sons are doing well, etc.
Everybody's fine, thanks.
Yay. Good. Good. Anybody else with a question or a thought for today? Yeah, Sandy, go ahead.
I was just wondering what we can do when our institutions may be failing us. For example, the University of Pennsylvania has been asked to turn over all Jewish teachers, students, staff, the names of all the Jews in the institution.
They've refused.
They've refused, but what if they fail and the Children's Hospital has been asked to turn over the names of those that are getting gender affirming care? So is there anything that we can do to support our institutions? That's the first question. And second, of all the books you've mentioned, like Furious, what book should we be reading if we were to pick one?
Yeah. So I may have to think more about the second question. I'm
Okay.
not sure what one book to be reading right now. I do very often return, for instance, to Ezra Klein's book on polarization as a good place to kind of understand a lot of what's going on. I do especially like Arlie Russell Hochschild's books, and that Stolen Pride book I think is very good for motivating sympathy for the people with whom we are in deep disagreement, for understanding why their politics take such a perverse form in the right era of Trump. In terms of what we can be doing, I've got more thoughts about this. One of the things I'll say is mobilize, organize, right? And so mobilize, show up at the demonstrations, right? And let it be seen publicly that this administration does not represent the will of the people of this country, and that the effort to intimidate, to coerce, is not working, right? And on the other hand, organize means more than that, right? It's one thing to show up at the No Kings protest. It's another thing to actually build lasting community capacity, infrastructure. And here I think the people I'm speaking with, we may be at a point in our lives where organizing is more difficult for us, but we need to be encouraging younger people to take the lead in recreating the infrastructure of democracy. I spoke about the media, but having a well-organized civil society, having social movements that don't just show up for protests, but that get out the vote, that build capacity, that show up regularly in ways that, prevent corporate interests from screwing their workers, right? In ways that prevent the abuse of power from going unimpeded. So I will then add, and here I'm drawing on a list from Sherilyn Ifill, whose work I like a lot. Just a number of things we can be asking Congress to do, right? Impeach Christine Nome, right, for lying and for these abuses. Tell Congress to hold up ICE's funding until ICE comes under control, right? And right, Chris Murphy, the Democratic senator from Connecticut, has proposed measures to make the funding for ICE contingent on the lawful conduct of ICE officers, including taking the masks off, wearing identifying features, using warrants before entering buildings. Ayanna Pressley, another right Northeast Democrat from Massachusetts, is trying to subpoena the records from the Department of Homeland Security. We can especially looking into Jonathan Goodman's. I think that name is not correct. The officer who killed. I'm sorry. Where am I? Yeah, I think there's a mistake here. But the officer who killed Renee Good, get Congress to subpoena, right? Did he really go to a hospital? Did he really have internal bleeding? By the way, why did he leave a crime scene so quickly? Do information gathering. There's another bill to strip ICE from qualified immunity from both state prosecution and from civil action, right? Right. obviously demand that Homeland Security leave Minnesota, right? These are all measures that I think we could be asking our representatives in Congress to be pursuing. And by the way, they're probably not going to pass in 2026, right? But they're going to increase the scrutiny on this administration, and they're going to then, on the one hand, right, generate more public accountability, and on the other hand, lay the groundwork for, if the Democrats regain control of Congress in 2027, actually beginning to hold this administration to account for what it did in the previous 2 years. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. It's one thing to say protest, mobilize, organize. It's another thing to say, and by the way, there are specific things our institutions should be doing. Cheryl and I found very helpful in just giving a little list. This is some of the stuff in Congress right now that would be meaningful if we could actually get action on it. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you. Thanks.
You bet. Anybody else for today? I'm going to go shovel some snow. Nice being with you, seeing all of you again. Not easy times, but I go back to the idea that when we analyze them, when we talk them through, when we recognize our commonalities, our sympathies, our questions, our outrage together, it does help us. So I hope it's helpful for you as well. As always, wonderful to be with you. See you next week and the week after that in person. Take care, everybody. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Yes, thank you, guys. Good seeing Liz. Bye-bye, everybody.